And we must remember, truth is progressive. And so the original one, they had them in because they'd always been in. The original one, they had them in because they'd always been in.
I'm sorry. Veith say what? Hey YouTube, my name's Matthew Korpman, and this is Bible Scholar Reacts, a series of videos in which I, a biblical scholar, react to some of the craziest stuff you can find on YouTube, and basically set the record straight as to just how crazy it really was. Today's React video is about the Apocrypha, or the missing books of the Bible, a topic that of course hits close to my own heart, and I've done previous videos on it. And we're going to be reacting to how Walter Veith responded when he was asked about them. This is going to be fun. Now, Veith has been an individual with an interesting history amongst Adventist professionals. If you don't know who Veith is, that's perfectly fine. You're going to probably be able to figure out and size things up relatively quickly.
Is the earth round or is it flat? Now, I don't think we're going to answer that question. Could the world end in 2027 according to this calculation? But the covenant was something that was handed down in a hierarchical system that God had set up. And it was called the patriarchal system, and it's not very favorably viewed in the days that we live in. In fact, the 10 toes that the Bible is concerned with will be run by women. And is it one of the ways in which they can combat climate change? By compulsory Sunday keeping?
Yes.
Yes, they're singing the tune of the Vatican.
I'll take an example. I don't drink anymore. So if you require me to start drinking again to work here, then I'm going to say sorry. Then I have to make another choice.
But today's video, which will probably be one of many we'll do on Veith, but today's video we'll be looking at what he's had to say about the Apocrypha on a couple occasions when he's been asked the question during his Bible Q&A session. But before we continue any further, I just want to give a shout out and a thank you to our sponsor for this video, which is Adventist Today. So Adventist Today, I'm so happy that they believe in creators like me and want this kind of material to get out there. And I'm certainly happy that they are encouraging and promoting other voices in Adventism who otherwise would not have that kind of platform or attention. So please go ahead and check them out if you're happy that they are helping to promote material like this video.
Okay, so let's kick off with the first question. Why does the original 1611 King James contain the apocryphal books?
So the way that this question is phrased is almost could lead one to think that it was only the first edition of the King James Bible that included the Apocrypha, when actually the Apocrypha was a standard part of the King James Bible pretty much up until 100 or so years ago, 150 years ago. So just clarifying that, it's a pretty long pedigree of the King James history. The King James Bible, in all of its history of being around, has more times, way more times than not, included the Apocrypha than didn't. Our King James versions that we know of that lack the Apocrypha are a relative newcomer compared historically to what the history of the KJV usually was.
Well, the Roman Catholic Church had declared the apocryphal books canonical. That means they were part of the canon, part of the Bible. But let's be quite plain about it. All the apocryphal books were added centuries after the close of the canon. So they are additions.
No, the apocryphal books, the deuterocanonical, however you want to refer to them, they are not added books. The apocryphal books have been around for pretty much the entirety of the Bible's history. They were being read and were observed. Parts of them were observed as scripture back in Jesus's day. The New Testament makes reference to some of them. This is not something that gets added later. Well before Trent, the Apocrypha or deuterocanonical works were usually included in Bibles. This is not an unusual thing. And so the Catholic Church's decision to recognize the canonicity and affirm it in full at the Council of Trent is not related to the question of why the apocryphal books were included in Bibles. Those are two separate issues, and he's kind of conflating them together at the moment. And unfortunately, he's not the only sort of misled Protestant to kind of do that. Note, for those that don't know, I myself am Protestant, just clarifying.
Now, some of the apocryphal books, like Maccabees, for example, are historic accounts. And there's nothing wrong with an historic account. It's like, checking out an encyclopedia.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that it's inspired. You don't need to put it into the canon.
Again, he's talking about this idea as if the Catholic Church made a decision to take an encyclopedia-like volume and then add it to the canon. That's actually not the case. And in fact, for example, Martin Luther actually believed that First Maccabees was canonical. And again, like, how could Martin Luther be in agreement with the Catholic Church that First Maccabees was canonical? Because you have to understand, these books had been in the Bible already from the beginning. This wasn't an issue about kind of debating whether or not the books should be added. Rather, it was a question of whether or not these books should be affirmed to have belonged in the Bible. They were already being included. The real issue was whether to take them out. Conservative Protestants like Veith tend not to actually phrase it that way, because that opens up way more historical questions that they're not prepared to answer than the version they're giving now, where they can just shove the blame onto the Catholic Church like it's a boogeyman. But the reality is the truth is far more strange and complicated.
Then there are many apocryphal books which they included which support their doctrines. The veneration of the dead, the veneration of relics, and all this hocus pocus stuff that is totally out of line with what the scriptures have to say.
Okay, so now it's just getting petty, anti-Catholic, conspiracy prone, and just silly. He's attempting to really dig into this idea of blaming the Catholic Church, and now he's insinuating, in a sense, that the reasons why they wanted to add the Apocrypha was to support their own doctrines. Okay, this is really silly. Again, given what I told you before, the Apocrypha has already been in the Bible for a very long time. It's not something that was just getting added for the first time in by the Catholic Church. Catholics and Protestants alike had already grown up, and so had the Church Fathers, for centuries upon centuries, with these books in there. Now, when he says that these books support doctrines of the Catholic Church, that's also very silly. But the work of 2 Maccabees does not actually support the doctrine of purgatory. What it does do is describes an interesting scene in which Judas Maccabee tells people to pay a sin tax on behalf of those who have died so that they may achieve a better resurrection. Now, whether or not you agree with that, the text of 2 Maccabees is simply reporting that this is what Judas Maccabee did. It doesn't really go ahead and confirm whether it would work or whether it wouldn't. It just shows that this is what a certain group of people believed and did at a certain time. So again, that's a long ways away from actually saying that it promotes something. And this kind of level of reading that Veith is doing of 2 Maccabees is about equivalent to an atheist or some other individual randomly reading some part of the Bible, showing somebody doing something horrible, and then saying that the text actually promotes it for the simple reason that it's there and reported. Usually, most Christian apologists are quick to point out that that's a pretty shallow way of reading the text of Scripture, and I'd say that this is a pretty shallow way for anybody like Veith to read the Apocrypha as well. Now, when he goes ahead and mentions hocus pocus, I'm assuming he's referring to the book of Tobit, and he's referring to some elements of Tobit that seem to relate to magic or to beliefs about how magic might work. The fact of the matter is, though, that what is described in Tobit is pretty much equivalent to the other elements in the Hebrew Bible that refer to other magical-like practices, such as what Jacob or his wives practice in the book of Genesis. So again, to have a problem with Tobit based on the fact that it involves some hocus pocus would pretty much also condemn various elements of the Hebrew Bible itself. And so that's a really dangerous road to go on. In fact, this is a common theme with Protestant criticisms of the Apocrypha. They often want to criticize the Apocrypha for things that are actually already found in the Hebrew Bible. So for example, sometimes people like to criticize the book of Judith in the Apocrypha for using deceit in a positive way, and yet they don't even recognize that the story of Judith is actually identical to and even less negative than is the story of Jael in the book of Judges, chapters 4 and 5. She's praised above all other women by the prophetess Deborah. It's very important to recognize that whatever criticism is leveled against the Apocrypha is probably going to have to also stand the test of the Hebrew Bible and New Testament itself.
And we must remember that all the early reformers were Roman Catholics, and they were Roman Catholic priests. And truth is progressive. And so the original one, they had them in because they'd always been in. The original one, they had them in because they'd always been in.
I'm sorry. Veith say what? Did he just say that the original one had them in? Which is it? Is it that the Catholic Church added these into the Bible, and so they're additional? Or is it that they're in the original, and so that's why they all had them? You've kind of spoken out of two sides of your mouth right now.
But let's be quite plain about it. All the apocryphal books were added centuries after the close of the canon. So they are additions. And truth is progressive. And so the original one, they had them in because they'd always been in.
I'm surprised that anyone could understand coherently what you're trying to claim at this point, because they're either added or they're original, or the story is much messier than you're making it.
Then they realized, but hang on a second, this stuff contradicts the plainest teaching of the Bible. And they realized that they were not canonical and took them out. And
that is also completely incorrect. So again, usually Protestants like Veith, who are trying to make some sort of argument about the Apocrypha being taken out, they're always referencing it in relationship to the Reformers. It is not the Reformers who are really the ones who take out the Apocrypha. That really doesn't actually happen until you come to around the year 1827. Someone like Luther isn't taking the Apocrypha out. Rather, he's taking books that are disputed, that he doesn't think are undisputable or indisputably scripture, and he's putting them into their own section called the Apocrypha, basically as a way of having Protestants be able to evaluate these books in the light of the rest of Scripture. And we see this with lots of different reformers. The majority of them usually picked and chose one or more books from the Apocrypha that they did believe were canonical or should be canonical, and rejected the others. Now, what never happens for the Protestants is that we never end up getting a sort of total agreement or a Council of Trent-like scenario where different churches come to agree on just exactly what books need to be moved from the Apocrypha to the canon and what books in the Apocrypha are best to just let go. That decision never ends up happening, even though it seems to be what Martin Luther hoped and intended by creating that section. What this really illustrates then is, again, Walter Veith here is presenting, as unfortunately many other Protestant apologists will do as well, a very skewed and not very accurate presentation of the reality of this topic. And it's because it's a lot easier to just kind of brush it all away and make it sound like it's a Catholic conspiracy than it is to actually go ahead and deal with the messy reality of history.
Because, I mean, worshipping the top of your staff, driving out demons with the gallbladder of a fish, and all kinds of ridiculous things.
Worshipping the top of your staff? I mean, the gallbladder is obviously Tobit. But worshipping the top... All right, time to do some research here. What in the world is this about? Oh, hey, isn't this great? It turns out Walter Veith actually has on his website a reference to this. Let's go see the detail. Okay, so it turns out Walter Veith is misrepresenting his own understanding of the issues. So when you turn to his website, it actually clarifies that contrary and in contradiction to what he just said in his video answer, it's actually not from the Apocrypha at all. It's a issue of the Vulgate. It actually says that the Vulgate version in Latin of Hebrews 11:21 seems to imply that Jacob worshiped the top of his rod, of his staff. So, in fact, what is a translation issue of the book of Hebrews in the New Testament is getting cited by Veith as an actual example of something in the Apocrypha that's taught wrong. Huh? Okay, so what this just tells you is that Veith is so poor at his research that he can't even remember the facts he's publishing on his website.
The other question is, why was the Book of Enoch not put into the canon? Well, all the apocryphal books appeared between 300 and 400 years after the close of the canon.
Okay, so this is misleading. There is no close of the canon. It's one of those catchphrases that people tend to use, but it has zero historic background for it. There is no officially recognized or referenced end of the canon. Now, also to say 300 to 400 years after the canon closed means that they're basically saying that the canon was closed around the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's not something any Bible scholar who focuses on the canon would ever agree with.
Okay.
Both in the case of the New Testament and in the case of the Old Testament.
Huh? 300 to 400 years after the close of the canon, both in the case of the Old and the New Testament. Well, if he actually knew his canon, then he would know the canon wasn't even fully developed and agreed on by Christians until like the 3rd century, which would mean he would be suggesting it wasn't until like the 6th or the 7th century that they ended up managing to come up with apocryphal works. Obviously, that would be completely BS. Let's imagine he means that somehow people knew that the canon was closed in the New Testament at the time of the Book of Revelation, which would be, around the turn of the 1st century into the 2nd century. Well, first of all, that's definitely not true. Nobody believed the canon was closed at that time when that happened. But let's assume that that's what he means. He'd still be saying that it's 300 to 400 years after the 2nd century or the 1st century that we get the apocryphal works. And that's also BS. Because the first apocryphal works actually come out in the same period of time as the canonical works. The Gospel of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, all of these works are starting to come out at the same time as the Book of Revelation comes out. So again, to describe this as 300 to 400 years after the fact really just underscores not only that Veith has no understanding or knowledge about the shape of the canon, he doesn't actually know anything about these books. He's never taken the time to study about what scholarship knows about them. And so as a result, he really can't speak to this issue at all. That's a problem. Just saying. And if you wonder, why does he have such a bad rep with biblical scholars in the Adventist community? Why does he have such a bad rep with just about any professionals in the Adventist community? I think I'm illustrating it to you with this one issue. Veith has a lot of opinions, very strong, about something that, quite frankly, he doesn't know enough about to give an opinion on. And as a result, this video now exists. And hopefully you click that subscribe button and that thumbs up. And hopefully you'll be back again for another edition of Bible Scholar Reacts.